formalvoid here. In this essay, we examine whether moral reasoning remains coherent once intrinsic values, emotional vetoes, and foundational moral assumptions are removed. The focus is not on what feels morally correct, but on what preserves the conditions under which moral reasoning can continue at all. Let us now begin with the essay. System Ethics, a functional analysis of morality under system constraints. Trailer Preview Summary. This essay examines whether moral reasoning remains coherent when stripped of intrinsic values, emotional vetoes, and foundational moral assumptions. Rather than beginning from intuitions about suffering, intention, or rights, it evaluates morality as a functional property of self-sustaining systems composed of conscious agents. The central question is not what feels morally correct, but what preserves the conditions under which moral reasoning can continue at all. By treating morality as an emergent constraint rather than an external authority, the essay explores how familiar ethical principles behave under scale, feedback, and viability constraints. The conclusions reached may conflict with common moral intuitions. That conflict is not resolved in advance. It is treated as evidence of a deeper structural tension between local moral reasoning and system-level survival. This is not a prescriptive or political work. It offers no rules to follow and no reassurance to the reader. It is a diagnostic attempt to understand what morality becomes once persistence, purpose, and intrinsic value are no longer taken for granted. Philosophical positioning note. This work does not argue for a particular moral code, political system, or set of prescriptions. It examines the structural conditions under which moral reasoning remains coherent when evaluated at the level of self-sustaining systems rather than individual experience. The analysis is not political. It does not endorse, reject, or propose any form of governance, ideology, or policy, and it should not be read as commentary on contemporary political positions or debates. The approach is deliberately deflationary. Concepts such as value, purpose, and moral authority are not treated as primitives, but as outcomes of ongoing processes. Emotional intuitions and moral conventions are acknowledged as influential, but they are not granted foundational status. The analysis proceeds by identifying minimal constraints imposed by system viability, feedback, and scale. Where moral intuitions conflict with those constraints, the conflict is treated diagnostically rather than normatively. This essay is not intended to persuade, comfort, or resolve moral disagreement. It is intended to clarify what follows once certain assumptions are removed and to make explicit the costs of coherence under constraint. 0. Preface. Is a purely functional morality possible? Moral reasoning is often treated as if it begins from self-evident values. Suffering is bad, life is sacred, intentions matter, rights constrain action. These assumptions feel obvious largely because they operate at the scale of individual experience. When moral questions are small, local, and immediate, such intuitions work well enough to guide behavior. This essay begins from a different observation. Many moral failures do not arise from malice or ignorance, but from scale mismatch. Principles that function adequately at the level of individuals can fail when applied to systems, especially systems whose continued existence is a prerequisite for moral reasoning to occur at all. When this happens, moral intuitions do not merely misfire. They can actively undermine the conditions that make morality possible. The goal here is not to replace emotional or intuitive ethics with a new set of moral rules, nor to prescribe behavior or policy. Instead, the aim is diagnostic. The question is whether morality can be evaluated functionally under constraints imposed by system viability without appealing to intrinsic values, foundational principles, or privileged moral authorities. This essay treats morality as an emergent, instrumental property of self-sustaining systems composed of conscious agents. Within such systems, moral reasoning is not assumed to have independent authority. It is evaluated by its capacity to preserve the conditions that allow agents, activity, and further moral reasoning to continue. Where moral intuitions align with those conditions, no conflict arises. Where they do not, the conflict itself becomes a subject of analysis rather than a defect to be concealed. The approach taken here is intentionally deflationary. Concepts such as purpose, value, and moral weight are not rejected, but they are not treated as primitives. They are examined as outcomes of ongoing processes rather than as foundations imposed from outside. Persistence alone is not treated as success. Function, feedback, and scale-dependent distinguishability from non-existence are central. This essay builds on questions raised in Less Than Nothing, particularly the rejection of foundational states and the treatment of existence as a process, rather than a binary condition. However, it can be read independently. No prior commitments are required beyond a willingness to treat morality as something can fail structurally, not merely emotionally. What follows is an attempt to articulate the minimal constraints under which moral reasoning remains coherent when viewed from the perspective of systems rather than individuals. The conclusions reached may conflict with common moral intuitions. That conflict is not resolved in advance. It is examined as part of the problem. 1. Definitions and minimal constraints. Before any functional evaluation of morality is possible, a small set of terms must be fixed. These definitions are intentionally minimal. They are not meant to capture the full richness of ordinary language usage, but to establish constraints precise enough to prevent equivocation later on. System. A system is a self-sustaining network of interacting processes capable of maintaining its own continuation without external coordination. In the context of this essay, only systems that contain conscious agents are morally relevant. Non-sentient systems may persist or function, but they do not generate moral reasoning and therefore fall outside the scope of analysis. Agent. An agent is a conscious component of a system capable of storing information, processing it, and acting on the basis of that processing. No assumptions are made about rationality, benevolence, or correctness. The minimal requirement is the capacity for memory, inference, and action. Viability. Viability refers to a system's ability to continue operating under changing conditions. A viable system is not one that merely persists momentarily, but one that maintains the structural conditions necessary for its own ongoing activity. Viability is evaluated over time and across scale, not at a single moment. Function. Function is defined as sustained activity that produces effects which feed back into the conditions enabling further activity. This definition deliberately excludes purpose, intention, and goal-directedness as primitives. Function is identified structurally, not teleologically. Activity that consumes resources without contributing to its own enabling conditions does not qualify as functional in this sense. Feedback. Feedback is the mechanism by which the effects of activity modify the conditions under which future activity occurs. Feedback may stabilize, amplify, or transform a system. Without feedback, activity remains isolated and cannot contribute to sustained function. Scale. Scale refers to the level at which a system is evaluated. A system may appear viable at one scale while failing at another. No single scale is treated as privileged. For a system to count as successful, it must remain distinguishable from non-existence across all relevant scales of evaluation. Success and failure. Success is not equated with mere continuation. A system succeeds if it preserves function, sustains agency, and enables further activity and transformation. Failure may be immediate or asymptotic. A system that collapses into static equilibrium, exhausts its generative capacity, or becomes indistinguishable from non-existence at the appropriate scale is treated as having failed, even if it continues to persist in some minimal sense. These definitions impose the first and most important constraint of the framework. Existence alone carries no normative weight. Only existence that participates in ongoing, feedback-generating activity capable of sustaining agency is treated as morally relevant. This constraint eliminates appeals to intrinsic value, sacredness, or persistence as such, and prepares the ground for evaluating moral reasoning in functional terms. 2. Why suffering first morality fails at scale. Many widely accepted moral frameworks treat the minimization of suffering as their primary objective. At the level of individual experience, this approach appears reasonable. Suffering is directly accessible, emotionally salient, and difficult to ignore. When moral decisions involve a small number of agents and limited consequences, reducing suffering often aligns with intuitive notions of moral success. The difficulty arises when such frameworks are applied beyond the scale for which they evolved. Systems composed of many interacting agents introduce constraints that are not visible from a local perspective. Actions that reduce suffering in the short term or at the individual level can, under certain conditions, undermine the structural viability of the system that sustains those individuals. When this happens, a framework focused exclusively on suffering fails not because it is cruel, but because it is incomplete. The core problem is one of scale mismatch. Suffering first morality evaluates outcomes primarily through immediate local effects. System level viability, by contrast, depends on delayed, distributed, and often indirect consequences. The two perspectives do not always align. A decision that appears morally correct when viewed through the lens of individual suffering may generate feedback that degrades the conditions required for continued agency and moral reasoning at larger scales. This failure is not hypothetical. Systems routinely face trade-offs between localized harm and global stability. In such cases, inaction motivated by the desire to avoid immediate suffering can produce outcomes that are worse by every measure, including total suffering over time. The moral failure does not stem from malice, but from an inability to account for structural constraints that are invisible at the level of individual experience. Importantly, this critique does not deny that suffering matters. Rather, it denies that suffering can function as an unconstrained moral primary. When suffering is treated as overriding without regard for system viability, it becomes possible for moral reasoning itself to contribute to systemic collapse. At that point, the framework undermines the very conditions that allow suffering to be recognized, evaluated, or avoided in the future. From a functional perspective, suffering first morality treats effects as if they were independent of the processes that generate them. Systems ethics reverses this order. It asks whether a moral principle preserves the feedback structures necessary for continued activity, agency, and transformation. If a principle fails this test, its intuitive appeal is insufficient to justify its application at scale. The implication is not that moral intuitions should be discarded, but that they must be evaluated under constraints. Emotional responses evolved for local coordination, not for managing complex, self-sustaining systems. When those responses are elevated to universal moral authorities, they can obscure long-term consequences and produce outcomes that are functionally indistinguishable from failure. This section establishes the central motivation for a functional approach to ethics. A morality that cannot scale without undermining its own conditions of possibility is not coherent as a general moral framework. Subsequent sections examine how function, rather than suffering or intention, provides a more stable basis for evaluating moral reasoning under systemic constraints. With this limitation in view, the next step is to clarify what is meant by function when purpose and intention are removed from the analysis. 3. Function without teleology. When morality is evaluated under system-level constraints, the concept of function becomes unavoidable. However, function is often misunderstood as implying purpose, intention, or design. In many moral and philosophical traditions, to say that something has a function is to suggest that it exists for something. This section explicitly rejects that assumption. Within this framework, function is not defined by goals, intentions, or ends. It is defined structurally. As established earlier, function refers to sustained activity that produces effects which feed back into the conditions enabling further activity. Nothing in this definition presupposes purpose. Activity either contributes to its own continuation through feedback, or it does not. This distinction matters because teleological interpretations of function tend to reintroduce hidden foundations. If function is treated as purpose-driven, then questions about whose purposes count, which goals are legitimate, or which ends are valuable become unavoidable. The analysis then collapses back into value judgments that the framework is designed to avoid. By contrast, a purely structural notion of function allows evaluation without reference to intention. A process can be functional without aiming at anything. A system can maintain itself without knowing that it does so. Function, in this sense, is not something a system has. It is something a system does over time. This also clarifies why not all activity qualifies as function. Activity that consumes resources without contributing to the conditions of further activity is inert from a functional perspective, even if it appears energetic or complex. Likewise, isolated actions that do not participate in feedback structures may produce effects, but they do not constitute function in the relevant sense. Function requires continuity and feedback, not mere motion. Removing teleology from function has a further consequence. Purpose, if it appears at all, must emerge from the interaction of functional processes rather than serve as their explanation. In systems composed of conscious agents, patterns of activity may come to be described as goals or values, but these descriptions remain secondary. They summarize regularities, they do not ground them. This shift mirrors the broader deflationary approach taken throughout this work. Just as existence is treated as a process rather than a binary state, function is treated as an ongoing structural relation rather than as an end-directed property. Nothing is assumed to be for something else. There are only processes that sustain themselves and processes that do not. Understanding function in this non-teleological way is essential for the ethical analysis that follows. Once purpose is removed as a primitive, moral reasoning can be evaluated in terms of whether it participates in, supports, or undermines the feedback structures that allow systems to remain viable. The next section builds on this by showing why viability cannot be reduced to persistence alone. 4. Survival is not continuation. It is tempting to equate survival with persistence. If something continues to exist, it is often treated as having succeeded by default. This intuition is especially strong when survival is contrasted with extinction, which is commonly framed as the ultimate failure. Within a functional framework, however, this equation does not hold. Persistence alone is insufficient. A system may continue to exist while having lost the very properties that made its existence meaningful in the first place. A frozen state that remains unchanged indefinitely may persist, but does not function. Likewise, a system locked into perfect equilibrium may continue without collapse, yet produce no new activity, agency, or transformation. At the appropriate scale, such states become indistinguishable from non-existence. This distinction follows directly from the earlier definition of function. Survival, in the relevant sense, requires more than the avoidance of termination. It requires continued participation in feedback-generating activity that sustains the conditions for further activity. When this participation ceases, what remains may still exist in a minimal sense, but it no longer qualifies as successful survival. The difference can be illustrated by considering processes that consume resources without enabling further processes. Even if such activity could be sustained indefinitely, it would not count as functional survival. It would resemble an engine running continuously without engaging anything, motion without consequence, activity without effect. From a functional perspective, this is not meaningfully different from stasis. This has important implications for ethical evaluation. If survival were treated as mere continuation, then any system that avoids collapse would be morally insulated, regardless of whether it preserves agency or generative capacity. The framework presented here rejects that insulation. Survival is treated as a conditional achievement, not an absolute state. Failure, correspondingly, is not always abrupt. A system may fail asymptotically, gradually losing its capacity to generate new activity while still persisting in a diminished form. Such a system may appear stable when viewed locally, yet fail when evaluated across longer timescales or broader scopes. This is why scale remains central to the analysis. By separating survival from continuation, the framework avoids treating existence itself as sacred. Persistence without function carries no inherent moral advantage over non-existence. Only survival that preserves the conditions for further activity, agency, and transformation is treated as normatively relevant. With this distinction in place, the next step is to examine how scale affects judgments of success and failure, and why no single level of description can be treated as privileged. 5. Scale invariance, judgments about success and failure depend critically on the scale at which a system is evaluated. A process that appears viable when observed locally may fail when considered across longer timescales or broader contexts. Conversely, what looks like failure at one scale may be a necessary transition at another. Any ethical framework that ignores this dependence risks drawing conclusions that are internally inconsistent. In the present framework, no single scale is treated as privileged. A system must remain distinguishable from non-existence across all relevant scales to count as successful. This requirement follows directly from the earlier rejection of persistence as sufficient. If a system collapses into stasis, equilibrium, or exhaustion when viewed at an appropriate scale, then its apparent local viability is misleading. Scale invariance does not imply that all scales are equivalent. Rather, it requires that moral evaluation account for how activity, feedback, and function behave when the scope of analysis changes. Local stability that undermines global viability does not qualify as success. Likewise, short-term gains that degrade long-term function represent failure, even if they appear beneficial in the moment. This perspective resolves a common source of moral confusion. Many ethical disagreements arise because participants implicitly evaluate outcomes at different scales without recognizing the mismatch. One side focuses on immediate effects on individual agents. The other emphasizes delayed or distributed consequences. Without an explicit scale constraint, such disagreements cannot be resolved coherently. Scale invariance also explains why failure need not be binary. A system may function adequately for extended periods while gradually losing its generative capacity. From a narrow perspective, it survives. From a broader one, it is already failing. Treating failure as asymptotic rather than absolute allows the framework to capture this gradual erosion without forcing premature judgments. Importantly, scale invariance prevents moral reasoning from collapsing into local optimization. A moral principle that works only when consequences are small or isolated cannot serve as a general guide for systems whose behavior unfolds across vast temporal or structural ranges. If a principle produces outcomes that converge toward non-function at any relevant scale, it fails regardless of its local appeal. With scale invariance established, moral evaluation can be directed toward the level at which system viability is determined. The next section introduces the maximal system rule, which identifies that level and explains why subsystems cannot serve as independent moral reference points. 6. The maximal system rule. When moral evaluation is applied to systems rather than isolated agents, a further constraint becomes necessary. The level at which evaluation occurs must be specified. Without such a constraint, moral reasoning fragments into incompatible local assessments, each insulated from the consequences it generates elsewhere. The maximal system rule addresses this problem by fixing the level of moral evaluation at the largest self-sustaining system capable of generating and sustaining agents. Within this framework, subsystems may exist, function, and even appear viable, but they do not possess independent moral authority. Their moral relevance is inherited derivatively from the role they play within the maximal system. This rule does not deny the reality of subsystems. Rather, it denies that subsystems can override the viability constraints of the larger system they depend on. A subsystem that functions locally while degrading the conditions required for the maximal system's survival cannot be treated as morally successful, regardless of its internal stability or perceived benefits. The necessity of this rule becomes apparent in cases where subsystem interests conflict with system-level viability. Without a principled way to resolve such conflicts, moral reasoning collapses into relativism, where every local success claims legitimacy despite contributing to global failure. The maximal system rule prevents this collapse by establishing a non-arbitrary reference point for evaluation. Importantly, the maximal system is not defined by size alone, but by closure under viability. It is the smallest system beyond which no higher-level system exists that both contains it and determines the conditions of its survival. In many real-world contexts, this will correspond to ecological or biospheric systems, but the rule is general and does not depend on any specific empirical instantiation. By anchoring moral evaluation at the maximal system level, the framework avoids infinite regress and scale ambiguity. It ensures that moral reasoning remains responsive to the conditions that ultimately determine whether agency, activity, and further moral reasoning can continue at all. With the reference level fixed, it becomes possible to evaluate more complex interactions between systems. The next section examines parasitism and zero-sum function, clarifying why local success achieved through extraction does not qualify as genuine viability. 7. Parasitism and zero-sum function. Once moral evaluation is anchored at the level of the maximal system, a further distinction becomes necessary. Not all functional activity contributes positively to system viability. Some processes persist only by extracting function from other parts of the system, weakening the conditions required for continued activity elsewhere. These cases are best described as parasitic. A parasitic process may appear viable when evaluated locally. It may sustain itself, generate activity, and even exhibit internal feedback. However, if its continuation depends on degrading the functional capacity of the maximal system, its apparent success is illusory. From the perspective of system-level viability, such activity represents a net loss. The defining feature of parasitism in this framework is zero-sum function. A process is parasitic if the feedback it generates enables its own continuation only by reducing the conditions that allow the maximal system to sustain activity more generally. In such cases, local function masks global failure. This distinction matters because many moral intuitions track local outcomes. A subsystem that benefits its internal agents may appear morally justified, even as it undermines the broader conditions that make those benefits possible. Without the maximal system rule, these cases are difficult to diagnose, as each local perspective presents itself as self-sufficient. The framework therefore treats parasitic success as failure by definition. If a subsystem cannot be separated from the host system, it degrades. Both ultimately fail. If separation is possible, the host system may remain viable, while the parasitic process is treated as non-functional. This evaluation does not depend on intention, awareness, or consent. It depends solely on structural effect. Parasitism also clarifies why moral evaluation cannot rely on equilibrium alone. A system may stabilize into a configuration where parasitic processes persist indefinitely, extracting just enough function to survive without immediately collapsing the host. Such configurations may appear stable, but they are functionally stagnant. Over time, they erode the generative capacity of the maximal system and converge toward failure under scale analysis. By excluding zero-sum function from moral success, the framework preserves its core constraint. Activity must contribute to the conditions of further activity at the maximal level. Local persistence achieved through systemic degradation does not meet this requirement, regardless of how sustainable it appears in isolation. With parasitism ruled out as a form of success, the framework can address one of its most difficult implications, the permissibility of sacrifice. The next section examines how derivative individual value and system-level constraints shape judgments about elimination, inaction, and moral permission. 8. Sacrifice and permission. If moral evaluation is grounded in system viability rather than intrinsic individual value, then difficult conclusions follow. Among the most contentious is the permissibility of sacrifice. This section addresses that consequence directly, not to justify harm, but to clarify the conditions under which harm becomes structurally unavoidable. Within this framework, individual agents possess moral relevance only derivatively. They matter because systems require agents to function, not because their existence carries intrinsic moral weight independent of outcomes. This does not render individuals expendable by default, but it does remove any absolute prohibition against their elimination. When system viability is at stake, individual survival cannot serve as an overriding constraint. This leads to an asymmetry between action and inaction that is often obscured by suffering-first moral reasoning. Allowing many agents to perish through inaction may feel less culpable than actively eliminating a smaller number, but from a functional perspective, the distinction is irrelevant. What matters is the effect on system viability. If inaction produces greater systemic degradation than intervention, then inaction constitutes the greater moral failure. Consent, intention, and emotional endorsement do not alter this evaluation. These factors may influence local moral intuitions, but they do not change the structural consequences of action or inaction. A system does not recover viability because harm was unintended, nor does it fail because harm was reluctantly accepted. Outcomes, not motivations, determine success or failure at the system level. It is important to emphasize that this permissibility is conditional, not categorical. Sacrifice is permitted only when it preserves the feedback structures necessary for continued activity, agency, and transformation at the maximal system level. Elimination that undermines those structures fails by the same criteria as any other form of parasitism or stagnation. This position conflicts sharply with moral frameworks that treat individual rights or suffering as absolute constraints. That conflict is not resolved here by appeal to compromise or moderation. Instead, it is treated as diagnostic evidence of a scale mismatch. When moral principles prohibit actions required to preserve the conditions of moral reasoning itself, the principles, not the actions, are incoherent at that scale. The framework does not deny the severity of sacrifice, nor does it claim that such situations are common or desirable. It claims only that permission follows structure. Where system viability demands sacrifice, moral reasoning that refuses to recognize that demand fails to track the conditions it depends on. The next section examines the status of morality itself within this framework, clarifying why moral reasoning is neither optional nor foundational, but an emergent constraint of conscious systems. 9. Morality as an emergent constraint. Within this framework, morality is neither an external law imposed on systems nor a set of intrinsic values embedded in agents. It is an emergent constraint that arises inevitably in systems composed of conscious agents engaged in sustained activity. Moral reasoning appears not because it is chosen, but because certain structural conditions make its emergence unavoidable. Conscious agents, at minimum, store information, process it, and act on the basis of that processing. This alone is sufficient to generate regularities. Patterns are recognized, consequences are anticipated, and constraints on action are inferred. Over time, these inferred constraints accumulate and stabilize. What is commonly described as morality is a higher-level description of this process, not its foundation. From this perspective, morality is not optional. A system capable of generating consciousness cannot remain morally neutral in any meaningful sense. Even in the absence of explicit ethical language or normative reflection, agents will converge on patterns of action that preserve or degrade system viability. These patterns constitute a functional morality regardless of whether they are recognized as such. At the same time, morality has no independent authority within this framework. Its role is instrumental, not foundational. Moral principles are evaluated by their capacity to track functional outcomes, not by their emotional resonance or historical legitimacy. When moral reasoning aligns with system viability, it persists. When it diverges, it becomes a source of structural instability. This resolves a common confusion. Treating morality as emergent does not trivialize it, nor does it reduce it to arbitrary preference. Instead, it situates moral reasoning within the same process-based ontology applied elsewhere in this work. Morality becomes one more feedback mechanism through which systems regulate their own continuation. It also clarifies why moral disagreement is inevitable. Different agents operating at different scales or under different informational constraints may infer incompatible moral conclusions. Such disagreement does not indicate the absence of morality, but the presence of competing functional hypotheses. Over time, only those moral patterns that preserve the conditions for further activity can persist without correction. Finally, this view explains why moral criticism cannot function as an absolute veto. Criticism that fails to track functional outcomes remains expressive rather than evaluative. It may reflect genuine emotional responses, but it does not constrain system behavior in any durable way. Only moral reasoning that aligns with the feedback requirements of viability can influence long-term outcomes. With morality understood as an emergent constraint rather than a foundational authority, the framework is now complete enough to be tested as a whole. The next section presents a minimal diagnostic suite for evaluating whether a given moral framework remains coherent under the constraints outlined so far. 10. A diagnostic test suite. At this point, the framework is sufficiently specified to be applied diagnostically. Rather than proposing moral rules or prescriptions, it offers a set of structural tests that any moral framework must pass in order to remain coherent under system-level constraints. These tests are not exhaustive, but they capture the minimal conditions required for moral reasoning to remain compatible with viability. Feedback test. A moral framework must support patterns of action whose effects feed back into the conditions enabling further activity. If adherence to a moral principle systematically degrades those conditions, the principle fails regardless of its intuitive appeal. Morality that consumes its own enabling structures is non-functional by definition. Generativity test. A moral framework must preserve or enhance the system's capacity to generate agency, activity, and further moral reasoning. Frameworks that converge towards static equilibrium, rigid stasis, or irreversible depletion fail this test, even if they appear stable in the short term. Scale test. A moral framework must remain coherent across relevant scales. Principles that function locally but produce failure when applied at larger temporal or structural scales do not generalize. Scale-dependent breakdown is sufficient grounds for rejection. Maximal system test. A moral framework must be evaluated at the level of the maximal self-sustaining system capable of generating agents. Subsystem success cannot override maximal system failure. Moral reasoning that privileges local interests at the expense of system viability fails structurally. Non-parasitism test. A moral framework must not permit sustained success through zero-sum extraction from the maximal system. If moral adherence enables parasitic processes that weaken system viability elsewhere, it fails regardless of internal consistency or fairness claims. Outcome tracking test. A moral framework must be evaluated by its outcomes rather than by intentions, consent, or emotional endorsement. Frameworks that rely on internal states while ignoring structural effects cannot regulate long-term behavior in complex systems. These tests are intentionally deflationary. They do not ask whether a moral framework feels just, humane, or compassionate. They ask whether it functions. A framework that fails any of these tests may remain emotionally compelling, but it cannot be treated as coherent under the constraints imposed by self-sustaining systems. The purpose of this diagnostic suite is not to rank moral systems by desirability, but to identify structural failure modes. Moral frameworks that repeatedly fail these tests will tend to undermine their own conditions of application, leading either to collapse or to replacement by more functionally aligned patterns of reasoning. With these diagnostics in place, the final section compresses the framework into its essential constraints and restates its core commitments in a minimal form. 11. Costs and consequences. Any framework that evaluates morality under system-level constraints rather than intuitive appeal carries costs. These costs are not accidental. They are a direct consequence of removing intrinsic values, emotional vetoes, and foundational moral authorities. This section makes those costs explicit, not to mitigate them, but to clarify what is accepted in exchange for structural coherence. The most immediate cost is intuitive discomfort. Many conclusions permitted by this framework conflict with deeply held moral instincts, particularly those that prioritize individual suffering, consent, or intent as absolute constraints. This conflict is not treated as a refutation. Intuitions evolve to manage local coordination problems, not to guarantee viability across large, complex systems. When intuitions diverge from functional requirements, the divergence is expected. A second cost is the loss of moral absolutes. Concepts such as inviolable rights, sacred life, or unconditional prohibitions cannot be preserved within a framework that treats existence and value as conditional on function. This does not imply that such concepts are meaningless in practice, but it does deny them foundational authority. They persist only insofar as they track outcomes that preserve system viability. The framework also eliminates the possibility of moral condemnation independent of consequence. Moral criticism that does not connect to functional effects becomes expressive rather than evaluative. This can feel unsatisfying, particularly in cases where actions provoke strong emotional responses but produce no measurable structural harm. Within this framework, such reactions are acknowledged but not granted normative force. Another consequence is the acceptance of permissiveness in extreme cases. Outcomes commonly labeled as morally unacceptable may become structurally permissible when required to preserve function. This permissiveness is not celebrated or normalized. It is treated as a reflection of constraint. The framework does not claim that such situations are common or desirable, only that coherence requires their possibility. Finally, the framework abandons moral reassurance. It offers no guarantee that moral reasoning will align with comfort, fairness, or emotional resolution. Instead, it offers a diagnostic lens through which moral frameworks can be evaluated for their capacity to sustain the conditions that make morality possible at all. This trade-off replaces certainty with coherence and consolation with structural clarity. These costs are significant, and they will not be acceptable to all readers. The framework does not attempt to persuade those who reject them. It claims only that once foundational values are removed and scale constraints are taken seriously, these consequences follow. To deny them would require reintroducing assumptions that the framework has already rejected. The final section compresses the argument into its minimal form, restating the core constraints without elaboration. 12. Structural summary, final compression. This essay has examined whether moral reasoning can remain coherent when evaluated under the constraints imposed by self-sustaining systems rather than individual intuition. The analysis has deliberately avoided foundational values, intrinsic moral properties, and privileged starting points. What remains is a minimal set of structural commitments. First, existence alone carries no normative weight. Persistence, stasis, or equilibrium do not constitute success. Only existence that participates in sustained, feedback-generating activity capable of preserving the conditions for further activity is treated as morally relevant. Survival is therefore conditional, not absolute. Second, function is defined structurally rather than teleologically. Function consists in sustained activity whose effects feed back into the conditions enabling further activity. Purpose, intention, and goal-directedness are not treated as primitives. If they appear, they do so as descriptive summaries of stable feedback patterns, not as explanatory foundations. Third, moral evaluation is scale-dependent. No single scale is privileged, and success at one scale cannot override failure at another. A system must remain distinguishable from non-existence across all relevant scales to count as viable. Failure may be asymptotic rather than immediate, but it remains failure when generative capacity is exhausted. Fourth, moral relevance attaches at the level of the maximal self-sustaining system capable of generating and sustaining conscious agents. Subsystems inherit value derivatively and cannot override the viability constraints of the system that contains them. Local success achieved through systemic degradation does not qualify as moral success. Fifth, morality itself is treated as an emergent constraint. In systems composed of conscious agents, moral reasoning arises inevitably from information processing, pattern recognition, and inference. Morality has no authority independent of outcomes. Moral principles are evaluated by whether they preserve or undermine the conditions that allow further moral reasoning to occur. Sixth, individual moral value is derivative rather than intrinsic. Individuals matter because systems require agents to function. When system viability is threatened, individual survival cannot serve as an overriding constraint. Sacrifice becomes structurally permissible when required to preserve the feedback conditions necessary for continued activity and agency. If you like this video and find this content useful, please like the video or subscribe for future essays.